Finn entered the sequel trilogy with a narrative premise that aligned more closely with the core structure of Star Wars than any other new protagonist introduced in the era. His defection from the First Order established an immediate thematic foundation built on agency rather than destiny. While other characters were shaped by prophecy, lineage, or inherited conflict, Finn's arc originated from an act of conscious refusal. He represented a break from predetermined identity, which positioned him as the trilogy's most accessible point of entry into its evolving political and social environment. This structural role grounded the story in character-driven motivation rather than mythic obligation. From a narrative perspective, Finn's origin provided the sequels with their clearest moral and thematic conflict. As a conscripted infantry soldier trained through indoctrination, he embodied the consequences of the First Order's authoritarian system more directly than any other character. His rejection of that system offered insight into how coercive institutions shape behavior, suppress autonomy, and construct loyalty through fear. This context framed the First Order not as an abstract villain, but as a governing apparatus capable of producing compliant populations. Through Finn, the trilogy had a mechanism for exploring the internal dynamics of the new regime in ways that extended beyond spectacle and into systemic critique. Finn also served as the trilogy's most structurally important connective point between personal stakes and galactic stakes. His introduction in The Force Awakens linked micro-level conflict, represented by individual survival, to macro-level conflict, represented by resistance against authoritarian control. His motivations drew from human-level consequences such as forced obedience, loss of identity, and the pursuit of self-determination. These motivations aligned with the broader thematic direction established in earlier entries of the franchise, where heroes rise not because of inherited power, but because they recognize the consequences of inaction. As a result, Finn's early arc offered a blueprint for how the sequels could combine character-scale decision-making with large-scale political storytelling. The dynamic between Finn and his immediate allies reinforced his position as the trilogy's emotional and narrative core. His interactions with Poe created a structural balance between idealistic leadership and grounded moral clarity. Poe's impulsive heroism contrasted with Finn's defensive orientation, producing a complementary relationship that highlighted differing forms of resistance. Meanwhile, Finn's connection to Rey introduced a shared foundation built on displacement and uncertainty. Neither began the trilogy with institutional support or mythic status. Instead, they represented characters who navigated conflict through improvisation and mutual trust. This alignment offered a pathway for the trilogy to explore companionship and cooperation as central narrative engines. Finn's presence also provided the sequels with opportunities to expand the franchise's understanding of identity formation. His transition from FN2187 to Finn signaled a departure from numeric classification toward personal agency. This shift aligned with themes present in earlier narratives surrounding name, heritage, and self-definition. Luke's rejection of passive farming life, Anakin's struggle with emotional identity, and Ahsoka's departure from the Jedi Order each reflected turning points where characters asserted ownership of their futures. Finn's introduction placed him within this tradition, but with a contemporary dimension grounded in institutional critique rather than metaphysical expectation. This distinction positioned him as a compelling figure capable of reorienting the saga's thematic focus. The structural potential of Finn's arc extended beyond personal development. His background as a former stormtrooper created opportunities to examine the First Order's military composition, recruitment strategies, and indoctrination techniques through a first-person perspective. Star Wars had rarely approached its conflicts from the viewpoint of individuals who once served the antagonistic faction. Finn's defection allowed the narrative to access information that would otherwise remain speculative. This positioned him as a source of insight for resistance leadership and created plausible avenues for strategic decisions based on lived experience rather than conjecture. These elements created significant opportunities for character-driven plot advancement. Finn's early actions in The Force Awakens also established his capacity for leadership. His immediate prioritization of civilian lives during the raid on Jakku contrasted sharply with the First Order's doctrine of unquestioned obedience. His intervention to assist Poe demonstrated initiative and moral reasoning despite years of conditioning. In subsequent scenes, Finn navigated unfamiliar environments and formed alliances quickly, which framed him as adaptable and capable of growth. These qualities align with characteristics historically associated with successful leaders in the franchise, where adaptability and empathy often carry greater narrative weight than inherited power. Structurally, Finn fit the mold of a protagonist positioned for long-term influence. His potential role within the Resistance was similarly supported by narrative design. Characters who transition from inside a regime to opposition movements typically bring specialized knowledge, logistical insight, and validity to reform efforts. Finn's presence offered the Resistance an opportunity to expose First-Order vulnerabilities, interpret strategic patterns, and understand the motivations of conscripted troops. This positioned him as an ideal figure for bridging ideological divides and expanding the Resistance's recruitment base. Through Finn, the trilogy could have examined the social dynamics that allow authoritarian movements to thrive and the processes through which individuals disengage from such systems. These were themes uniquely accessible through his arc. Finn's hinted connection to the Force introduced an additional dimension that had potential to reinforce the trilogy's thematic direction. Rather than framing the Force as the inheritance of rare bloodlines or ancient institutions, Finn's sensitivity suggested a more decentralized distribution. This aligned with the conceptual framework presented in earlier stories, where the Force exists beyond strict lineage. A former stormtrooper discovering an intuitive connection to the Force would have diversified the representation of Force users and broadened the philosophical scope of the saga. Such an arc could have positioned Finn at the crossroads of spiritual exploration and political reform, integrating personal growth with broader mythological development. Finn's stalled development also influenced the trilogy's approach to the Force. His initial signs of sensitivity created an opening for the sequels to reframe the Force as a broadly accessible phenomenon. Such a direction would have reinforced thematic decentralization and diversified the representation of Force-capable individuals. However, the later installments minimized this thread, shifting Force-related exposition toward lineage-based narratives. This decision constrained the trilogy's mythological scope and reduced opportunities for exploring non-traditional pathways to Force awareness. By not expanding Finn's sensitivity, the trilogy limited its ability to update the Force's philosophical framework for a new era. Finn's placement in secondary subplots further altered the trilogy's pacing and focus. His assignments in The Last Jedi and The Rise of Skywalker placed him in narrative spaces that operated parallel to the central mythic arc rather than within it. While ensemble storytelling can diversify thematic exploration, the distribution of character arcs must remain aligned with the trilogy's structural through-line to maintain cohesion. Finn's separation from the primary mythic conflict weakened the relationship between personal stakes and galactic stakes, resulting in a narrative landscape where individual motivations became unevenly integrated. His presence in logistical missions, auxiliary engagements, or supporting roles reduced his thematic influence despite his earlier structural importance. The trilogy's world-building was similarly constrained by the reduction of Finn's central role. As a former stormtrooper, he offered direct insight into First-Order training facilities, disciplinary structures, and operational environments that could have enriched the trilogy's depiction of conflict. Without this perspective, the First Order's expansion and military behaviour were conveyed primarily through external observation, rather than internal analysis. This limited the film's capacity to articulate how the organisation maintained control across diverse systems. A deeper investigation of indoctrination, hierarchy, and enforcement methods would have strengthened the trilogy's political commentary. Finn was the most viable conduit for delivering such information, and sidelining him left these areas underdeveloped. Additionally, the trilogy missed an opportunity to explore the psychological aftermath of indoctrination. Finn's early scenes demonstrated uncertainty, residual fear, and moral conflict, all of which signalled a complex internal landscape. Sustained examination of these factors would have allowed the films to address the cognitive processes associated with deprogramming and identity reconstruction. By not continuing this work, the trilogy reduced the psychological realism of its character dynamics. Themes associated with recovery, reintegration, and personal autonomy remained largely unexplored despite the presence of a character, Yi, whose background made such themes structurally relevant. Finn's relationships also experienced narrative stagnation due to his reduced centrality. His initial interactions with Ray and Poe established a foundation for cooperative development. However, later films redistributed relational focus across expanding character rosters, which diluted the mutual growth potential established in the first installment. Strong trilogies often rely on consistent interpersonal dynamics to anchor long-term storytelling. Finn's shifting placement within the ensemble limited the trilogy's ability to maintain relationship arcs that evolve through shared conflict and cumulative experience. This redistribution fragmented character cohesion across the trilogy's structure. From a structural perspective, Finn's sidelining also affected how the trilogy conveyed information to the audience. Characters with inside knowledge of antagonistic systems often function as narrative translators, helping the audience interpret the motivations, strategies, and vulnerabilities of those systems. Finn was ideally positioned to explain the First Order's internal protocols, recruitment processes, and ideological frameworks. Without this function, the films relied heavily on exposition through dialogue rather than integrated character-driven insight. This shift reduced the clarity and depth of the trilogy's political and military world-building. The trilogy's failure to expand Finn's arc also diminished its potential to explore alternative forms of leadership within the Resistance. His background as a defector positioned him to develop leadership skills grounded in empathy, personal experience, and strategic insight. Instead, leadership responsibilities shifted toward characters with more traditional trajectories or legacy connections. This choice narrowed the trilogy's perspective on governance and Resistance organization. A character with Finn's background could have introduced new approaches to command, informed by his understanding of authoritarian structures. Without this angle, the Resistance's evolution remained anchored in familiar archetypes rather than innovative perspectives. Finn's narrative stagnation further influenced the trilogy's thematic symmetry. Strong trilogies often rely on structural mirrors between characters on opposite sides of a conflict. Finn's early presence hinted at the possibility of such symmetry with characters like Kylo Ren, who represented the inverse experience of privilege within the same organization. Developing this dynamic would have highlighted systemic inequality, divergent responses to indoctrination, and contrasting paths to autonomy. Instead, Kylo's arc proceeded without such a counterpart, limiting the trilogy's capacity to explore institutional contrast through paired character development. Additionally, Finn's underutilization created missed opportunities for examining collective action. His background made him the most logical character to initiate discussions about stormtrooper autonomy, mass defection, or structural reform. While The Rise of Skywalker briefly introduced another group of defectors, the trilogy did not build the groundwork needed to integrate such developments into its core narrative. Without Finn's sustained leadership, these elements appeared isolated rather than cumulative. A trilogy that foregrounded Finn's perspective could have depicted systemic change through incremental acts of collective resistance. Finn's diminished presence also altered the trilogy's narrative balance. His early arc provided a grounded counterweight to mythic escalation, ensuring that personal stakes remained visible amid large-scale conflict. Once his arc lost centrality, the trilogy leaned heavily toward mythological escalation and high-stakes confrontation. Without a character who embodied human-scale perspective, the film shifted toward narrative abstraction. This change weakened the trilogy's ability to maintain equilibrium between spectacle and character-driven storytelling. In conclusion, Finn's initial placement positioned him as the trilogy's most structurally coherent protagonist, providing avenues for political exploration, psychological depth, force expansion, interpersonal cohesion, and systemic critique. The decision to sideline him did not merely reduce his role, it altered the trilogy's entire narrative architecture, diminishing opportunities for thematic development and weakening internal consistency. Finn's arc offered a framework capable of integrating personal agency with galactic-scale conflict. By not sustaining that framework, the sequels lost a central organizing principle that could have unified the trilogy's thematic and structural direction.
Thank you for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that share button. My main channel is Critical Analysis Hub, where I post Star Wars content about the movies. My secondary channel is Critical Analysis Hub Plus, where I focus on the shows of Star Wars. And my third channel is Critical Analysis Hub XP, where I post comic books. Be sure to take a moment and check them out. Thanks, and may the Force be with you.